Hey, welcome to Tank Talk. I'm your host, Bob Tankard. And this evening's guest, a dear friend, almost like a sister, Dr. Elaine Weintraub, educator, explorer, just about everything. Professor Elaine has done it all in the short time she's been here. Elaine, welcome. Welcome
Thank you.
to Tank Talk. You know, it's been a long time since we did a show together. I know you've been traveling all over the place. But Elaine, you've been what almost want to call an explorer. You know, you explored the Native American heritage when you developed all the things from over in Chappaquiddick, the trails, the fishery, and everything, the identification, and now the Underground Railroad. A piece of that is coming back. You know, now, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But Elaine, tell us a little bit about 30 seconds about yourself, and then we'll get into the whole show.
Well, I think my interest in inclusive history stems very much from my own ethnic experience and my experience as an educator, where in my first job in America, my first job in education in America, I saw for myself the inequality of education, the inequality of opportunity, and the fact that the history was not there. And it became my personal mission to address that in any way I could. And at first, the thought was, well, I'll go buy books that will share the history.
They didn't have them in the books.
No, they did not. I could have bought at that time. Books were still widely sold, and the Bunch of Grapes had a huge table, and I could have got books about ghosts of Martha's Vineyard, trees of Martha's Vineyard, movie stars, nighttime skies, ghosts,
but nothing.
Trees, whatever, cats.
Yeah.
One cat had his own book. The cat at Ali's store, Lambert, he had his own book with his photograph on the cover, but not one word of the African American experience on Martha's Vineyard. I knew enough to know it was here, so I went to find it.
Now, you have been very instrumental in finding two sites recently. One's in Edgartown and one's in Aquinnah. Explain.
The Edgartown site, I'll begin with that because it was the first to receive national recognition on Martha's Vineyard. Okay. And for many years I'd heard.
Now, let me ask you a question before you get into that.
Sure.
Was Edgartown Seaport the seaport where most of the vessels come into the vineyard rather than Vineyard Haven?
Yeah, the whaling ships.
Okay.
And Edgartown, contrary to what we all know about the 20th century in Edgartown, before that, Edgartown was the most diverse town on the island.
Really?
I've read the crew lists of William Martin, the captain whose life I researched many years ago. I read his crew list. They came from everywhere and came into Edgartown.
And they settled there?
Sometimes.
Okay.
And there was a maritime population that was diverse, Native, African American, and white. And there was some coexistence on all of that. The 20th century changed, I think, with the gentrification of Edgartown.
Right.
And it became a place that people of color definitely couldn't stay.
No.
Jewish people couldn't stay.
No.
It was very clear. So what happened was I was looking years ago when you had to do research, you looked through these envelopes.
The archives.
And they are literally envelopes with pieces of old newspaper cut out by Eulalie Regan. God bless her, she was lovely. And I would go through these and I found the story of Esther. And what was interesting about Esther's story was that she had escaped from the harbor in Edgartown, where she was being taken back to North Carolina to enslavement, or to the Carolinas anyway. And she'd escaped. and they'd taken a deposition from the first mate of the boat that was taking her back. Now, these would have been kind of bounty hunters that were taking her back. And in his deposition, he said, we tied her down with ropes, we put a crowbar over her feet, we chained her. But in the morning, when we got up, she was gone. And instantly, you know, I have a historian's mind, that detailed mind. Now, wait a minute, let me think about this story. How'd she disappear? Did somebody help her? Did they lie about what they did?
Were there abolitionists here on the island at that time?
Yes.
Okay.
But the nature of disobeying a law, a very unfair law, a terrible law, both Fugitive Slave Acts, the very nature of it, you're not going to publicize what you did.
Exactly.
So somebody helped her, because no human being can get out from ropes and chains and a crowbar.
So somebody had to write down how she was tied up.
Yes.
And then when they helped her become free, wrote that in the paper how they did that.
And in the deposition, it said that they didn't help her. They tied her down. They put the crowbar on her feet, but she was gone. Now, maybe they lied and they did help her.
Yeah.
Or maybe, my personal feeling is she was gone in the morning, they said, with a rowboat from the boat. I suspect she went to Chappaquiddick.
Okay.
Which would have been a Native American, but now that's only a suspicion, because clearly.
And what year was this like?
That was 1743.
So it was before the Civil War.
Before the Civil War.
Yeah.
And she would have been.
Were there many, in 1743, there would have probably been a number of Native Americans over there on Chappaquiddick at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Would have been primarily Native American.
Before they moved to Aquina.
Yeah, well, the Chappaquiddick tribe is different from the Aquina tribe, and they never got federal recognition in the same way. So that's a whole other issue. But what's interesting about this story, I mean, it made sense to me that she would have tried to get to Chappaquiddick. Somebody helped her, but slavery at that time, enslavement, the institution itself, was practiced here in Massachusetts till 1782.
So it was very easily, she could have probably been a slave here on the island.
She could have been.
And somebody probably owned her, or was going to own her, or however.
It's possible, but I think she was owned by a slave owner in the Carolinas who must have asked to get her back.
So you're saying
they were taking her back.
So you're saying that she probably came through the Underground Railroad to Martha's Vineyard.
That's what I think.
Okay.
That would make sense, wouldn't it?
Right.
Because what was she doing here if she was, if she had a slaveholder that was demanding her return?
So there was slavery in Massachusetts. Some people had them.
Yes.
And there was a great sense of abolitionists here that wanted to free people. So this person that probably freed her and maybe got her into the Native American population on Chappaquiddick so that she could hide and whatnot, and then eventually get shipped up to Canada, Nova Scotia, and all those other places.
That's the hope, that she certainly was never heard from again. So good luck to her. She did get away. Let
me ask you a question. You have, over the years, opened up many doors dealing with Native Americans, African Americans. How is this impounding the history of Martha's Vineyard and the histories in the school system?
Well, I think the history of Martha's Vineyard, what I've noticed in the last few years, there's a considerably developed interest now in a more inclusive history. People are actually confronting some of what happened. People are genuinely curious. And it's what we've been told and what we haven't been told. That's the story with history. It depends who writes it, doesn't it?
Let me tell you something. Way back when both of us was in the school system, I'm talking about in the early 90s, and they were changing the Educational Reform Act across the country. And the only real subject that they had the most difficulty with in changing and updating it was history. And the things that I remember after going to the meeting at the State House and whatnot and meeting with various people, one of the topics that they had was, how do we write the history of this country? You know, because it was so much wrong in it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, certain populations, Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanic, was never copyrighted to what they accomplished for this country.
No.
You know.
Well, when you think that the country had a huge head start by being built by enslaved labor.
Right.
Nobody had to pay any wages.
Right.
The whole, to my mind, you include all the stories, but we've only been given one story. And it has always struck me from the very first day I looked at a U.S. history textbook that here we have a group of people ostensibly devoted to liberty and freedom. The country is built on that concept, who were almost all slaveholders.
Exactly. They were.
And so how does that work?
You know, you have a lot of false statements, a lot of people that, you know, say one thing and do another thing. You know what I mean? In a sense, it's really, in some cases, no different than today. You know, you have, you know, certain people saying we're this and we're that, and yet they don't stand for any of those things. No. You know, it's about self-preservation, it's about, you know, being of themselves. How do we teach in our school systems what you're doing with the charter school right now? How do we get that in our school system and correct and right what was wrong? You know what I mean? Like, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said that he didn't understand Black history in the North, in our northern schools, until he went to college. And I said, when I went to the University of Massachusetts after coming out of the military, and they had Black history, offering Black history in the college university, I said, I began to see and know the accomplishment of my people at that time. I said it was a real eye-opener. I said, but many whites began to see, wow, you guys did this, you guys did that. But it would never trickle down really to the public school. Why?
Well, I think that you have a difference between some public schools and others. There are districts that have taken it on themselves to develop a good history curriculum. There are, like the New York 1619, the New York Times curriculum, which the Republicans absolutely hate. They totally hate it. That curriculum dates everything from the arrival of the first slave ship in America, because slavery and all that went with it, it shaped the country and it shaped our history, and yet we have never confronted it. Public school teachers use history textbooks. Those history textbooks have to pass muster in every state.
Right.
They're very sanitized.
You know, I'm going to say that you're working with the charter school right now. And how are the children accepting what you're going through? And I want to ask you a little bit about the two sites. Where are they, and where are they going to be dedicated, or have they already been?
No, the two Underground Railroad sites. One is at Memorial Wharf.
Really? I could see that. Right.
And they're going to be on the actual wall, you know, that above the wharf.
Okay.
And we've already got the plaque.
All right.
We had a very generous donor who paid for the plaque and who is arranging its installation.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And we're hoping to dedicate it and celebrate it on the 27th of July, because that's the day Esther escaped.
Okay.
So she escaped on the 27th of July in 1743. She's waited a long time to get our day, but we want to be able to tell her story. And the plaque is large, and it has some quotes from the deposition, and it talks about justice, and that's going to be a big deal.
And what about the one in Aquinnah?
Aquinnah, we already have the site. It's the African American Heritage Trail site that has been accepted by the Underground Railroad as a national site. So that's a big deal.
And where was that located? Up in Aquinnah?
West Basin.
The West Basin.
Yeah, on the tribal land. The tribe
Now,
gave,
that down Lobsterville area?
yes.
Okay.
The tribe gave us the Heritage Trail land to put a rock and a plaque in 2002.
Wow.
And we had a huge celebration and tribal drumming and everything, and it was a great moment, because you wait so long for anybody to recognize.
Is that the one that's going to be named after the students? You said the students. You said some students will be named. The trail will be named after the Chilmark students.
That's at the charter school.
That's at the charter school.
They're creating a trail called the Nameless Trail.
And where's that at the charter school?
It's going to be at the charter school.
Okay.
It's, in fact, the plaque's probably being installed there this week, but we're going to dedicate it formally on May 20th. That is to tackle that whole topic of enslavement. The students researched individual names that I gave them of people who had been enslaved on Martha's Vineyard. And it's a very...
Was it a large population?
It's...
I'm talking about, was it 10? Was it 20?
In relation to the population of the island, which was small. We have, I think, altogether named 15 to 20 people.
Okay, that's good sized population back then.
Many people, though, when you look at the old wills, are just referred to as 4 Negroes, because the will would be probated, everything you own.
Right.
So you read these wills in the probate office in Edgartown, and it'll be like my mattress, my horse, my house, my knives and forks, my 4 Negroes. So we don't know their names.
Okay.
And even when we do know their names, they're not their names. You know what I mean? They're the names that were given to them. So I kept thinking, how can I present this to 11-year-old kids at the charter school who, God bless them, have never encountered enslavement? How can I explain it in a way that they'll get it and not just blah, blah, blah and have it go over their head because they hear slavery and what does it mean? Oh, there was slavery. Doesn't mean anything. So I made the focus losing your name. And I thought that was something concrete. And the kids, I think they got it. Each student.
What were their feelings? Once you open their eyes, once you open your eyes to that, you got to open your heart to it too.
Yeah.
You just can't just close everything up. When they opened it, you know what I mean? It was like something new to them and aware. And they say, I think that people today look at suffrage and suffering a lot different than they did, 50, 100 years ago. I think they say, man, that's unfair. That's, you can see the protest that goes on today. It's not just one population, it's multiple populations of people out there saying it's wrong. And then a lot of them are young, but there's some older ones in there too. How did these kids perceive what you were telling them? Did they have a different heart after looking at people?
I think they do. I was impressed by their willingness to discuss. We began every session with the discussion, drawing on what they already knew. And they had some information. The school's done a good job. They had some information that they understood. When I brought it to the names, I think it gives a level of reality.
Right.
Because they can imagine. Who knows more about being bullied and given names that are not your name than kids? And their hearts are open in a way that they're not defensive. They're not thinking, oh, well, that was, how could this be? And, it's not so, and this is just upsetting everybody. They don't feel like that. And one little boy was painting his rock, because they're painting a rock named for a person.
Right.
And I'd explained that the names they had we would use, but we know they're not their names. So he was painting Peter, age 10, and he put the age 10
Right,
on
right.
the rock. This was related to a bill of sale that we'd looked at of a kid who was sold who was 10. And I looked over his shoulder while he was working very seriously, very into it. I looked over his shoulder and I said, imagine how that child felt that day.
Mm.
And he looked at me and said, yes. I said, he was probably, what do you think? I said, scared? And he said, oh yeah. He said, but just think about it. Think about his family. Look what they lost.
Mm.
And I thought,
He got it.
I thought he got it.
He got it. He got it. You know, one of the things that we're talking about, you look at the new movements that are taking place, and people are not just settling for things of the past. They want to see change. And I can't help to think that the younger generation out there today, they want to see equality take place. They're sick of this, you know, I'm better than you, you're underprivileged because you're black or you're Hispanic, you're this, that, and the other. They're saying, no, let's all come together. I remember speaking to a young gentleman, and there was one of the young gentlemen at one of the last shows that we did over when you were at the high school. And the young gentleman said, he says, I know that when I leave the island, I'm going to meet individuals with different perspectives than mine. They're going to be racist, they're going to have this, that, and the other. He says, but I do not have to change. I can still focus on making a difference in our society. Do you think over the next, 20 to 30 years that this new generation is going to make some major changes?
I really hope so. I believe so. You have to believe, don't you? You have to hope that there will be change. I think that the murder of George Floyd that we all saw, it went worldwide. I was in Ireland for quite a long time during that whole process. It was daily news,
Yes.
as was the trial for the person who murdered him. I think it shook people to their souls. And I think that for many people who had avoided knowing it, or who had said, these things happen because they start up with the police. Why do they start up with the police? Well, why are they in high crime areas? Taking superficialities. You've heard them all.
I heard them all.
Yeah. I think had to look at that somebody had another human being kneel on his throat till he killed him.
Yeah, and there was 4 policemen involved.
And
a man was handcuffed.
And nobody, so he was executed for maybe passing a false $20 bill.
I heard today that yesterday that the $20 bill wasn't false.
And even if it was, execution is a pretty extreme.
About the kid, it's like the execution because of a traffic violation, and the kid gets shot and killed, and it was a mistake. You killed somebody because of a mistake. You let me kill somebody, and I said, oh, it was a mistake, and see what they do to me.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I want to ask you a question.
Absolutely.
Because this came out after the president gave his union speech. Tim Scott, an African-American senator from, I think, North or South Carolina. He comes out and says this statement. I couldn't believe he said it. There is no racism in America. I want your opinion on that statement.
I thought it was a classic example of inner conflict because he just detailed 2 issues, 2 times that he had been the victim of racist attack. And then he said there was no racism. And he looked like somebody in total conflict. I looked at him, and here you have somebody who's hitched his wagon to this whole belief, this Republican narrative that what's done is done and what's past is past, and we have a history that unifies us all, and we don't need to go there. That's his group, and so I see that.
You think I thought he was coached in that? I said he had to be coached or persuaded somehow to make that statement like that. I don't know of any dignified African American, Native American, Asian American, or Hispanic American that would have said that. That would have said that after knowing the history of what the country has done, to saying that it's nothing, and knowing what's taking place now. You know, how many African American men have been killed and none of them had weapons, shot and whatnot. And you know, if you were running away and you had no weapon to run, then you're not a threat to me.
Yeah.
You know, and I got the gun, the laser and everything else, and I shoot you in the back, you know, you're running away. You're not a threat to me. No. You know, eventually I can go get you again, something like that. So I don't know how he could make that statement. And then the statement that Rick Santorum made, as though Native Americans never contributed anything into the building of this country. Where did that come from? These are people that are in political elected positions in high government, making these statements like that. Yeah. And people going along and believing it.
I think you have with Tim Scott, I think you had somebody who sold his soul.
Yeah, I guess he did.
Because he knows perfectly well. I mean, I know from being around African American students for most of my career, Brazilian students, I know how racism works. I've seen it in action against young children. I've seen it's systemic. Right. It's not that everybody is personally committing to being a racist. Right. They don't question it. No. It's the way it is. Those kids can't behave. Right. Those kids can't learn. That's just the way that's in the consciousness. He knows that. I don't believe that he doesn't know that. But he's opted for a position, and
self-preservation.
He must have known he was being used, because they only have one black Republican senator. So it was him or who. Yeah. And so he makes this speech, but you know, there's a price you pay for selling your soul.
It sure is. It sure is. I want to ask you the question, the new generation. Where do you think the new generation is going to take us?
I hope that the generation of children, that the soul searching we've seen with the adults, I'm hoping that the new generation of children will inherit a better world. That they will say, it's really important that all the stories be told. And to do that, we have to do it, not just talk about it. Right. We have to collect all the stories, the immigrant stories, the African American stories, the Native American stories, all of the people who have made this country, who worked for this country.
That's right.
Need to be part of its story. And I would think that history is where you make the difference.
You know one thing, what else? You know, when you look at the scientific things, you either invent it and you see it and it's exposed to everybody. And you really can't deny it, okay? Mathematics, you can't deny the numbers. Right. You know, you can falsify literature if you choose to. And I think that's what happens in history. We falsify the truth, or we shortchange individuals, you know. And I said, you know, we are a country of immigrants. Yes. Of immigrants. Everybody from every nationality from around the world lives in the United States. You know what I mean? And they brought something different to the pot. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I'm saying to myself, wouldn't it be better to celebrate that than to try to discourage and to denigrate what happens? What happens if you got rid of, I'm a believer, if you got rid of all the Hispanics, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, you got rid of all of them, somebody else is going to take the bottom line. Somebody's going to be a person, because sometimes I think that's the nature of the beast. You know what I mean? Somebody's going to take it. Why can't we? It would be better if we could get together and work and support each other.
Absolutely. And I think, too, that what we've got is not history.
No.
What's taught in schools is kind of a unifying myth that was put together, the activities of a white ruling upper class group who dominated the country until quite recently. I mean, for example, did you know that Woodrow Wilson was a member of the Ku Klux Klan?
Yeah.
It's not in the history books. In the history books, he's a wonderful person who goes off to France to try and make the French and the British reach a good peace agreement with the Germans. What a guy.
You know,
He
it's
was a Klan member
right,
who ordered the birth of a nation to be shown at the White House.
Right. Right, in 1955, 54, 55, you had 150,000 Klansmen walk down the street of Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And I'm saying to myself, how do you build a country, unify a country or people when you have that?
Yeah.
When you have that. You know, I want to ask you a question, because you've done so much for the island. Not only the island, I can remember years ago when you went over to Oceanographic and you did things that, in fact, it was because of you, I was invited to go over and do a presentation, you know? And thank God for your information that I was able to use. But what's on the agenda next? What's the next thing for Elaine?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the Oceanographic, because I'm in correspondence with them at the moment, and we're meeting. They've always, for the last 20 years that I know of, had a Harambe during Black History Month. They want to do a Juneteenth celebration, and they wanted to do it with the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard.
Wow.
So we're figuring out how we can do that, you know, with the COVID restrictions. What are we going to do? Is it going to be something virtual? Are we going to do a ceremony for Juneteenth on both sides of the water? Maybe jump on the boat and do it on the boat.
But the governor is supposed to loosen things up by August 1st, isn't it?
I don't think, but it's June 16th, isn't it, for Juneteenth?
All right. So
I mean, whatever it is, it's the fact that they're so willing and they approached us, which is wonderful. I'm hoping that we're going to, our big project for the rest of the year, and hopefully through for the next 2 years, is about Black property ownership and entrepreneurship on Martha's Vineyard. We're hoping to get funded for that, which would be great. But the number of wonderful stories that I have heard, and I've only heard some of them over the last few months, from people, mostly women, not always, but mostly, who acquired property and opened boarding houses that brought people of color to Martha's Vineyard.
My mother was one of them.
And provided a safe place. That is what we're trying to do. We're going to try and create a whole register of that. We've got so many. There's Dunmere by the Sea, Shearer Cottage, Taylor's Playfair, Ora McFarlane. There's just so many.
Well, you know one
Georgia
thing,
O'Brien.
my mother actually came to the vineyard by way of Plymouth Rock. When she was there, she heard about Martha's Vineyard, and she heard about the Cape, you know, Patty Page's song, "Old Cape Cod."
Yeah.
So she went to the Cape, and she met a woman, an African-American woman, and said, if you think this is beautiful, you should go to Martha's Vineyard. And when she went to Martha's Vineyard, they were going to go, my father and her and a couple of my sisters were only going to stay for like an overnight, a couple of days. Well, they went into an African-American rooming house, and they stayed a week in the rooming house right down there by the inkwell, you know? And from that moment, that next year, in 1959, she convinced my father to rent a house for the summer, and it was up by the old Ocean View, okay? And we rented a cabin. And at that moment, we saw that many of the young men and women that came down to live on the island for the summer were in rooming houses, African-American owned rooming houses. And that's the story in itself.
That is the story. Yeah. It's an enormous story. It's a wonderful story. I knew Ora McFarlane very well. I used to end all my tours by going to sit with Miss Ora and drink coffee and eat our muffins. And we used to exchange stories. And the stories she told, the way I always remember what she said, the way it was, we charged $9 a week. If you didn't have 9, we'd take 7.
That was about Back then, that was a pretty good piece of change, but they couldn't understand they were negotiating.
Yeah, and she would make breakfast for
Yeah,
them,
yeah.
and she would make the evening meal because,
Right.
of course, with segregation that de facto existed,
That's right.
there was where you could go, where you couldn't
Where you
go,
couldn't
and,
go,
and
right.
everyone always knows where they can't go.
And everybody basically stayed within their town. When I came
Right.
in 1959 and then moved here in 1960, it was still a population of the winter was only like 4,500. And people didn't venture off into the other towns. You know,
Yeah.
they stayed within their own town, except for the people living in West Tisbury and Aquina and Oklahoma. They had to come down to Vineyard Haven to go to the store.
Yeah.
But in other towns, you stayed right in your town. You didn't venture out much.
I remember that, when I first came, the first year I was on the vineyard, I worked for a lawyer part-time. My kids were tiny babies then. And this lawyer, Jim Reynolds, he'd asked me to go visit, get a deposition signed by somebody who was selling property up in West Tisbury. And I phoned the man, and I was used to thinking like an Irish person, which is you're always going somewhere. And I said, well, the next time you're down, this would have been 1985, I think. I said, the next time you're down in Edgartown, come by the office and get the, you can sign the documents. And he goes, oh, Edgartown. I haven't been in Edgartown, I think, since the celebration of the end of World War II.
He's probably right.
I said,
And he
that's
was
40
probably
years
right.
ago.
Yeah.
He said, yeah, well, I haven't got much use for going to Edgartown.
That's right. No, really. People didn't travel, especially the old generation. It wasn't until, I think, the regional high school came about, and then the kids started moving around, and then the island naturally improved.
Yeah.
Elaine, we ran out of time. This has been a great time, and it's always good to be with you and to
Thank
hear your
you.
stories. And I just want to thank you for your accomplishments that you have done over the years in bringing the attention of the African American, Native American story to the people on the vineyard and to people around the world, and especially those that come to take the ride around the trail during the summer. And you have an open invitation. You know that, right? You know that. And I want to thank you for tuning into Tank Talk. And until next time, this is your host, Bob Tankard, saying good evening.